Okay, thank you for joining me. Hope you are well. I can see one or two familiar faces from yesterday. I'm going to put my screen on yours. If I'm sure we're all webinar pros by now, but if you're on a phone or a tablet, you might need to just tap the screen to see the chat box. I'm just going to type in hello. So if you just let me know where you're watching from while I just get everyone inside. We've got about 60 people here today. Excuse me, and I'm going to launch a poll just for a bit of feedback. If you took part in the webinar, I did one yesterday on Beginner's Guide to Memory. I've been doing it all through lockdown. It's not essential if you haven't. Just give me an idea of where people are at. So we just put in those results on your screen, and then in the chat box, let me know how, so where you're watching from. So say hello. Is the sun out? It's a bit colder today, isn't it? It's not so fun here in North London. And could you give me so this is an advanced masterclass, and I don't claim to be a neuroscientist, which will be interesting given what I go through. But could you give me a B for beginner, an I for intermediate, and an A for advanced in terms of your understanding of memory? So this is going to be a bit more theoretical today. My beginner's guide, despite people that took part in illusions, it was a bit, I tried to make it a bit more pragmatic. I think that's a tough one, actually. I was just speaking with a school who I've done a couple of webinars with, and we did one on beginner. And the staff feedback was two things. One, they wanted practical ideas, and I think that's the challenge with what we know about research, full stop, never mind just being memory. And two, when I do some quizzing and testing what we've learnt, there was the fear and the panic of being asked, and then that embarrassment of not knowing the answers. And this is essentially what it is all about, because this is what happens in the classroom. So I'm going to try, and I'll get into details. It's 3:30. I'm going to probably be a good hour. So say hello in the chat box. You should have a voting thing on your screen. If you're just taking part in my beginner's guide, so I can get a sense of audience. So say hello in the chat box where you're watching from. Give me a B for beginner, I for intermediate, and A for advanced. And then we'll get started. And at some point, I'll bring you in on your videos and your audio recording. If you don't want to take part in anything, just probably just switch your video off. Just safeguarding, I'm going to be sharing the video of the slides on my site. So I know we're all working at home, so if you've got kids in the background, try your best to kind of keep them away from the camera if possible. That would be appreciated. Okay, so here are the results. So I've seen 56% of you before, so welcome, thank you for coming back. So what I'd like to do, let me just get rid of that. I'm hoping you can see that on your screen. Yeah, okay, great. So that's the results. I'll put a few more up as we go along. It's the first time we're meeting, my name is Ross, been a teacher 25 years. I'm a blog, and I've been in lockdown for 12 weeks. So I'm just creating a few webinars to keep myself busy, a bit of brain food, and trying to just share what I've been reading, essentially, for a good 4 or 5 years. But particularly, well, specifically on lockdown, getting a bit more time to read and research. So I'm going to do a little recap on the basics. So people that have seen the beginner session, some of this should be familiar. Again, it's to just support that retrieval. And for new people, it might just get us off to a good start. Here we've got the key domains: short-term memory, new information, working memories, quizzing, retrieval. So what's the fourth letter of the English alphabet? Long-term memory, you can ride a bike, you can tie your shoelace. Sometimes that is conscious, sometimes that is unconscious. And the more times we do these things, it does become subconscious. And what I've been reading about in this book, I signposted this yesterday for people watching. I'll be reading this book called The Brain by David Eagleman. It is here. And I had to put it down after the first chapter because he started talking about London cab drivers, and having lived in London for 27 years, Cabbie drivers have to learn 25,000 street names within the 6-mile radius of the city of London, and only 10% of them pass. So I was really intrigued as to what happens in the teaching techniques, first of all, and also what happens in their memory, and how this, I believe, between the neurons, it's called the synapses, and these go stronger and help connect memories. And then there's something called knowledge buoys, which is the term for if you're a beginner on a moped with a map doing all the different routes to practice for exams. So there's a blog if you want to read that. All the slides are going to get recorded and shared through the video. So don't worry about writing everything down. So long-term memory, learning street names, the alphabet, tying your shoelace becomes subconscious because your memory starts to store that information in long-term memory. Within this area of your long-term memory, so that subconscious and conscious are, so your conscious is implicit, your subconscious, explicit, and the other one's called implicit. So let me just show you that on this slide here. Implicit, subconscious, explicit, conscious. And within those areas, so I'm going to come back to these two shortly, essentially we are developing concepts, rules and facts. This knowledge waits to be stored, turned into action, so it's stored waiting to be of service. That's my understanding. Now I shared this graph yesterday, and I think I could spend the whole day on this talking about lots of different scenarios. So the hardest thing for all of us is translating all this theory and adapting it into your own setting. And all of you will be watching from different parts of the world, teaching different kids, and each of us also have our own working memory and your ability to understand what I'm trying to share and how I've translated the research. And what I found interesting reading that book, The Brain, this morning on my dog walk, so let me just put that book up there, that one there, is that each of us communicating and sharing is, I know it sounds obvious, but when I heard it said out loud on this audiobook, we're contributing new knowledge by sharing and strengthening these synapses, these connections between our own memories and other people that we talk to. And this is all pretty much in this graphic. Environment, home, the classroom, sensory, so someone banging outside, a quiet environment. I can hear my son next door having a chat with one of his mates on a kind of video game call. He's been banned on his iPad all day, actually, just for your information. He's been a bit naughty lately. So the sensory memory, so that's affecting our moods, it's affecting his moods, and our ability to pay attention. I think if I could ask people to mute your microphones, that'd be great. You can unmute yourself when I ask some questions later. This then, just here, impacts on your ability to pay attention. So background noise, as you just saw how it impacted on me teaching this. Then we come over to here, the working memory, and this is the quiz, the retrieval between what we transfer to our long-term storage and then recollect as we do things through retrieval, repeat, rote learning, whatever you want to call it. Now, I've read this, I'm going to signpost, I've got 4 books I'm going to show up on the screen. The first book's this one. So this is kind of taking it a little bit further than what I've been reading. This is called Why the Brain Matters by John Tidke. I believe John lives in Wales now, or Cumbria, I'll have to double check, but he's just completed his PhD, and this is the book as a byproduct of his research. And I think this is a good overview of cognitive science in terms of what teachers need to do. And what I realised, and I know a bit embarrassing, I suppose, John wrote about one of the blogs I wrote about 5 or 6 years ago about me understanding my own experiences of trying to translate cognitive science. And I look back in horror just of a bit of my naivety, but we've all been there before. But so that's how I came across John's book accidentally, but I've read it and I think it's fantastic. So it's been very interesting connecting with John. He suggests, and there's lots of things, so I'm not going to talk about all these, but on the screen, lack of sleep. I don't know how your sleep is during lockdown. Mine has been pretty stable. Certain days, I've woken up in the middle of the night because I'm not doing my normal physical work, so I'm trying to exercise to help with my energy levels to make sure I have a good night's sleep. Screen time, I have had the privilege of trying to think of who I can signpost you to. I've read a fascinating book called The Cyber Effect. I'm just going to see if I can get the right blog to show to you. Yeah, this one, here we go. By Dr. Mary Aitken, who's an Irish cyber psychologist. And I've just done a podcast with her, so it's going to be out this weekend. That's her book there. Honestly, it should, I'm a huge fan of social media, obviously, under a screen time disclaimer. But some of the stuff she talks about here has really transformed my thinking as a parent and as a teacher about screen time. And also the world of social media, that currently we are quite happy to take the benefits without really switching it off with all the things that are going on in the world, the nasty things, sex, cybercrime, those types of things. So screen time, she talks about there, which I find fascinating. Diet, and then the myths of the brain, the left and right hemispheres. And then he also talks about genetics, way above my skill set or knowledge. Really fascinating book. So I'm going to come back to John's book. So that's just getting started. If I take it a little more advanced, again, this is just moving from basic to a bit more advanced. In this long-term memory, so for people watching for the first time, you've got, I mentioned earlier, you've got what's called declarative knowledge. So that's your concepts, rules, and facts which are stored. I ask you a question, it turns into an action, and that becomes procedural knowledge. So under here, where this is either explicit or implicit, things like riding a bike, tying your shoelace, knowing the fourth letter of the English alphabet, and then I quiz, it becomes in your working memory and perhaps conscious. And for people watching yesterday, I did say I might dress up as a chicken. I didn't manage to get my outfit ready, but I might make the webinar a bit more conscious in your memory because I'm doing things a bit differently. Priming, as a design technology teacher, I think I associate this, my schema, with undercoat, with paint undercoats. So it's a bit like bias in some respects, or building up layers. So if I said doctor, you're either thinking of a man in a white lab coat, or you might be thinking of a female in a white lab coat, or a green lab coat in an operating theatre. So those are influences. Episodic and semantic. Episodic is unreliable, it fades over time. It's also influenced by bias because it's often birthdays, weddings, buying a house, your first job, and often those are typically, well, not always positive. I know I suffer here, particularly if I think of, or if you think of any serious negative times in your career, these might be episodic memories. So if I think of a couple, when my father died, was a really tough academic year. When I was made redundant, that was a very tough year. And then when my school was put in special measures as a deputy head, those are episodic memories. And what I've done, well, obviously they're real experiences, but my memories of those events are emotional and episodic, and they fade over time. And then I choose what to remember, and I build up a story around them. Compare that to semantic, which are knowledge and facts. Here is a big pen. I could tell you exactly what material it's made from, how to use it, how long it is, etc., etc. Okay? So we'll come back to that graph. Here's the next book. I mentioned this one yesterday. So this was my starting point, start of lockdown. In fact, I have had this book on my table since it was published. By Trish Taylor, and what inside it's got 3 sections on memory, mindsets, and relationship, and how they all interconnect with one another. But I'm going to signpost Trish's book. It says £16 on the back, so it's probably worth checking out. So I'm going to signpost lots of things that she says about retrieval, repeating exercises are essential to learning. Now I'm going to put this on. This is where I start to get out of my comfort zone, and where I'm starting to think I need to learn more about the brain, hence reading the book on The Brain by David Eagleman, which I believe, I should double check, was published about 3 years ago. Let me just open it up and just double check. 4 years ago. Okay, so episodic we've got here, so it's all long-term storage. Episodic memory, procedural is an action, declarative is knowledge and facts. Now what I've done on here, and this is where I get out of my comfort zone, and I don't claim to have any knowledge yet is the areas of the brain. So there's some of these words that I'm aware of, but what I'm trying to just show in a graphic is the differences and what they are. Okay, I've got one more slide from John's book. I've added this graphic. The picture of this brain isn't in the book. I've just added it. But essentially, your working memory is your brain's notepad. I quite like that analogy. In Connect the Dots, Trish Taylor calls it a wardrobe, a bit like a metaphor for hanging up your shirts. And can you remember where all your clothes are stored? Now in here we've got the phonological loop, which is one aspect of the brain which stores your words. And then you've got your visual spatial sketchpad, which stores your images. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with dual coding. Some of you might not be. In fact, let me just signpost one more book. These are all my books I'm reading and got on my desk every day. Dual Coding by Ollie Cavalieri. Ollie's a primary special needs teacher based in London. His books are all got the kind of words and pictures theories. So that it's not learning styles, dual coding. Here's an image, here's a bit of text, and I present it at certain times to help reduce your working memory or your cognitive overload. So a bit more there. Right. So in here, if we look at these two areas, all of us are developing what's called a schema. My own schema of the word schema, if that makes sense, is I think of schema as a scheme of work in my head, a curriculum plan as a teacher. So schema is the official term for building up concepts, rules and facts and helping you recall things. So examples are, I'll show you some examples. I talked about yesterday in my beginner session. If I said the word Turkey, some of you might think of the top, middle, or the bottom image, and whether it's the country itself or the flag. So each of us have got a schema, and they relate with each other, and they build up a mental model, and they help us to recall. So just some facts from Trish Taylor in terms of paying attention and building up that schema. And again, I'm going back to this graph. Environment matters, which is why teachers are critical players here in terms of leveling the playing field, because Ross might not have a stable environment where he gets a good night's sleep. He might be on his device till 3 o'clock in the morning, whereas Jenny next door, Jenny's my wife, it's easy to say a name. Jenny gets a good night's sleep. She doesn't stay on her device. They both come to class. Ross is half asleep. Jenny isn't. You've been there before. So we level the playing field, and you can see how those things already stop all this happening. Okay. So Trish says these. This is a little example in her book. If I get £10 pocket money each week and I want to buy a pair of trainers and also a pizza, I don't have enough money to buy both. So she describes paying attention in the same way. We have to continuously decide. Now, what I read this morning in David Eagleman's book was he gave the story, if you come to a crossroads and you're left or right and you choose to go right, he was discussing lots of research to say that your brain has already made that choice, even though consciously you feel that you're making that decision there and then. And the other thing I found fascinating about reading the book, so I think I'm on chapter 4 now, is I think I'm an ideas person. And I'm always producing lots of new ideas. But he said these ideas don't just come to your head. They've been stored for months and perhaps years, and then they just come conscious at that moment. And then that's when we go, I've got an idea. So I'm finding all this very interesting. So your attention is limited, just like it is watching me here. And it varies. And the difficulty, whether doing a webinar or a teacher training session or being in a class with 30 kids, is you've got to decipher how people can stay alert and attentive to the task that you set. So I've said schema there. You've all got different words for different things, different ways of remembering things. And I'm going to move on to working memory capacity. So back to Trish Taylor's book. If you look at the 3 pictures of the buckets, they're different sizes, and the little face essentially says where they are in terms of being full. So this medium-sized bucket is medium full, this large bucket's nearly full, and this small bucket's almost empty. And these are essentially 3 different children with different working capacity and they're full or not full. And again, what she says in some research that she unpicks is that a classroom of 30 kids, if they're all 7 and 8 years old, at least 3 of them you can expect to have a working capacity of a 4-year-old, which I think 1 is frightening, 2 is probably the reality, and 3, I think of all the struggles I've had in the classroom and some of the things I used to do foolishly looking back 10, 15 years ago in terms of my practice. And that frustration that a child didn't understand, it's probably the way I was presenting material and lots of other things. But go back to this diagram again. I was probably not paying attention to what the child said. I probably didn't have a good night's sleep. And I know when I've not been very well or tired or exhausted or stressed, it makes a big difference in how I taught. So how do you see poor working memory? So here are some examples. Kids not behaving, they lose their place. They say, "Miss, can you just say that again, please? I didn't understand." And they make poor academic progress. So all the obvious cues that you'll be familiar with. And then I'm just going to come back to one more piece of writing before I pause. This book, I don't have a copy of this book. I've been reading it online. They have picked out this research by Bailey and Pranksky, so you can see the link at the bottom. And what I found fascinating about this was, if you take an 8-year-old, so if you look at line 2, for example, and add 2, that equates to their attention span. So 16 is 16 plus 2, 18. So your year 11s that you teach. And actually adults, they said that it's potentially 20 minutes. So I just wonder if it is 20 minutes. So I've been speaking to you for 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do in keeping with memory is I'm just going to pause. Now I'm going to turn the screen off, grab some water. I'm going to wait a minute, just give you time to digest. Can you either go and stretch your legs, stick your head out the window, get some fresh air, go and get a glass of water, just in keeping with what the research says about memory, just so I don't increase your working load. Okay, and I'm just going to leave that research there, and you might want to just Google it while I come back. So I'll be back in literally 2 minutes. Okay, everyone. So a little pause in keeping with the research. I actually think when I do get back into schools, whenever that will happen, if I do a teacher training session, yes, when I do a bit of theory and we do a question and a discussion, and I try to chunk things into 10, 20-minute exercises, I think the more I read about memory, the more I think back to all the CPD sessions I led as a deputy head teacher, and all the inset days I've led, my own inset days I now lead in different schools. That if this is what memory keeps telling us, that we can only store up to 4 to 8 pieces of information, and after 15 or 30 seconds of instruction, everything else starts to get lost. Maybe we should just make CPD 20, 30 minutes in size. So in the chat box, what is your typical school professional development experience? Is it a 6-hour inset day? Is it 30 minutes after school, an hour and a half? Just give me a bit of feedback. What's your current model for professional development? Three hours after school, ouch. Okay, so real mix. Inset day, 1 to 3 hours. So when I think of all the things, so obviously the 5 inset days, the twilights. When I built Mark Plan Teach with my staff, we did CPD every week, and occasionally one week we wouldn't do it for whatever reason. And some sessions were all together. Then eventually we moved to a model where it was workshops, and they were in 20, 30-minute slots, and people could choose, and some were directed and aligned with people's research or appraisal. And I guess what I was probably doing as a leader was experiment with different methods, but time and time again, teachers without doubt said they loved the workshop mix, they loved the practicality of it, and they loved the kind of short and sharp and kind of chunky sessions, rather than Ross is always talking at the front, and we're stuck in a hall for an hour, 2, 3 hours, and maybe all day. So there's the research, folks. There's that book again, Memory at Work in the Classroom, Bailey and Pranksky. Right, I'm going to bring it all in. I'm just going to unmute your microphones. Anyone got any questions before I move on? Any questions, anybody, so far? No. Okay. All right. Well, I'll move that out of the way, and I'll plough on.
I have one before you move on, please, Ross.
Yes.
So thinking about what you said about priming and episodic and semantic memories. Yeah. How does that play out in the classroom? So, for example, my understanding, please correct me if it's wrong, that if I'm teaching, for example, appeasement in my World War II sessions, that the children will remember maybe perhaps the tasks, maybe the working with each other in groups, and they'll also remember the semantic memories, the facts, Neville Chamberlain, for example.
Yeah.
When we come back to it, they might confuse the episodic and semantic, and they become detached from each other. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, going back to that taxi driver scenario, they do a mixture of episodic and semantic. So that's why they do the runs through the streets to get that practical experience, and then they do the theory. In Trish Taylor's book, Connect the Dots, she talks about take kids on field trips, take them to the cinema, take them to the bank or whatever, so they get that real episodic, immersive experience alongside the semantic knowledge and facts. And then what you're doing is that retrieval, the quizzing, to help build up the knowledge. And then in class, what you have to do is test for misconceptions through your questioning, through your mock exams and things like that. The challenge for all of us is there's a screenshot of what it looks like, but this is going to be very different to a 4-year-old, to a 16-year-old, to if you're a maths teacher or a drama teacher. And I think that's where it starts to become difficult for us all. We all have to take this research and translate it for ourselves. Does that help, Darren?
No.
Yeah, I think
okay.
So. For me, the way I see it in my classroom is that I would then undergo a lot of retrieval practice for them to remember the semantic memory.
Yes.
Because I'm still trying to get my head around it. For me, if we want the children to then pass exams, then obviously they would need the semantic memory to be strong instead of the episodic memory of the lessons. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that retrieval is critical. So someone's just asked the question. I don't know if I've got it in these slides, but have you seen the retrieval practice grid I've showed last month, last lesson? If not, if you remind me at the end, Darren, I'll show you a simple methodology, but it's essentially just making sure that you keep recapping every lesson as you go through the curriculum. Right, I'm gonna move on just for keeping time, but if you remind me, Darren, at the end, I'll show you that grid, retrieval grid, and then I'll pop it up on the screen. So the importance of, if we show worked examples, so recipe cards, how many, in the chat box, tell me what you can cook from memory without checking the recipe. Let's show off our recipe skills here. What's the thing that you can cook if your mum comes around and you can show off? So you've got spag bowl, chili con carne, chicken de bolognese, risotto. Okay, I'm coming around to yours, Peter. And Liz for crumble. Scrambled eggs, love it. Okay, so these are worked examples, okay? So I've taught design technology, Blue Peter teaching. By default, we demo making the product ourselves with the kids. And I guess in the weaker design technology lessons that I've taught or observed are when examples aren't provided. So now the research shows time and time again that they need worked examples. So I'm going to show you an example what I would do in the classroom, and the reasons why it's important. You've got 5 reasons on the screen. It's an effective way to learn. Think of the cab driver. They go through the streets and they build up that knowledge, and then it's tested. It saves a lot of time and energy in the long run. I'm just going to reach behind my computer. I'm sure you all have got a visualizer. I've now got a fancy one on my desk here, but I've also got a little one. Let's see if I can just grab it out amongst all my wires. So I take one of these on my travels, and last time I checked, this one just goes on a little stand. Really simple one, about 20-30 quid. I've been using one like this for about 15 years. I'd probably say it's the best resource I've ever purchased in my teaching career to model examples. And of course you do them at your whiteboard, but to have it on your desk while you're sitting, the kids are getting on work, and you can draw or write and things, or grab a kid's piece of work and take a picture and model it. It's been transformational for my teaching, and a huge deal for the kids when their work's up on the screen and you can Wi-Fi it around the class, things like that. So worked examples. Now, there's 2 terms I want to point out here: product orientated and process. Okay, the final product and the process towards that. And I'm going to give you some examples. Now, Darren asked the question, as ever, the more schools I visit, the more teachers I work with, the wider my lens has become in terms of that macro overview of teaching, and the more I realise beyond my own little bubble that teaching's incredibly nuanced. And you see it all over Twitter as well, that polarisation. And it's through no fault of your own. What you do in your world is right, but it might not work for someone else. So product orientated is when you define a learning task, and you pay attention to the problem to reach that goal, and then you model it. So I'm going to give you an example. Process is explained in this way. It's why something has to be done in a certain way. So I'm not a mathematician, but there's going to be certain rules that you have to follow to get the right answer. Same with a scientific experiment. And what the research says about this is necessary to help transfer that information, long-term memory from real life situations. So that's episodic experience, Darren, to that learning context, which helps long-term retrieval, which is that semantic knowledge. So in Trish Taylor, here's just a summary of hers. So she talks about the recipe example and that pizza example I gave you earlier. Balance is needed, and modeling, and she essentially says don't over model. Okay, sometimes holding back information is good for kids to explore. Now what I would do, I'm going to give you an example. There's my visualizer. That's the one that I would use. This is based on Rosenshine's research. If anyone's not seen it, just a signpost. You type 17 in the blog. So Barrett Rosenshine, I wrote about this in Mark Plan Teach in 2016. 17 principles of effective instruction. At the bottom, there's the graphic. This is his 40 years of academic research into teaching and learning. What I've tried to do to bridge the gap between research and theory, or that theory and practice, is I've just restitched them into, that's what the research says. Here's what you can do in the classroom, my experience of what you can do in the classroom, and there's a resource. If you've not read the original paper, there's a link here. Open it up. It's about an 8-page PDF. It's not too hard to read. It's very interesting. I would ask all of you to look at all these and then work out what a worked example looks like in your setting, because all of us are going to have different answers. I might model number 8, thinking out aloud, in a moment. So what Rosenshine recommends is that you model. So I do it first, kids watch me. Then we do it together. Let's work it through together. And then you do it on your own. And I'm going to blend between product and process. Now, here is an image of a Rubik's Cube. And I might start with a blank bit of paper with you. And I want you to draw this. And let's just say, for context, you're in year 7 and it's your first graphics lesson. Now, this video is upside down. For the life of me, I've struggled to try and get it rotated the right way around, but this was done on my visualizer. I probably need to shoot it again. So I'm just modeling a simple creating technique. So the lines are parallel and they follow certain angles of a clock face. And again, this one's upside down, so apologies. So you get the idea. So I'm just going to mute that. And if you watch my camera, I'll do the same process. So I'm going to draw a clock face. And I'm going to mark out 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 4, 6, 8, and 10. And this is my little rough sketch. I'm going to mark out the angles of that clock. And these are the lines that I follow. So the first 3 lines are from 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock. I'll just do it on the table for accuracy. So there's my first 3 lines. 8 o'clock, 2 o'clock. My 3 lines across from 10 to 4 o'clock are here. And then I've got 4 parallelograms in the middle. My vertical line, 12 to 6, goes through the center. And then I construct that grid. And then you can see, like I'm doing on the camera, if I just shade in the top, I'm doing this very roughly and in fresh air without a board. You get the idea. And then eventually over time, as a worked example, we remove the grid lines. So that's where I want the kids to get to, which is there. Okay, the kind of start and the end. And you do all this all the time in your class. And then this is the point where we're talking between, here's a model, how I explain it, how I model it is all in your working memory, and how that knowledge is transferred to your long term through semantic episodic information. And then what we can do, if I play this screenshot, so I've tried to do a really rubbish doodle of this as a step-by-step, so hopefully this will work. So there's a work problem. There's my 3 lines from 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock, the angle. I then draw the 10 to 4 o'clock. I then draw the vertical lines through each center. So there's the parallelogram. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4. The vertical lines through the middle. I'm presenting a visual and an oral example. And then I start to bold the vertical lines, the 10 o'clock to the 4 o'clock lines, and then the 8 to the 2 o'clock, and then I end up with the cube, and then take away the guidelines. So I've just tried to do a simple step-by-step there, and that's essentially what I might model on the board. So back to worked examples, recipes, using visualizers. It allows us to explore solutions. Another one that I often do, I'm a big fan of non-verbal communication. If I type this equation, some of you will have seen this before. I've got an equation on my maths board, 7 times something equals 28. I can present this in 2 ways to offer some dual coding and help support working memory. Version 1 is 7 times something equals 28. Version 2, 7 times something equals 28. So it's a matter of just seeing the differences, very subtle, and I'll make version 2 a bit more stronger. Here's version 1, 7 times something equals 28. Version 2, 7 times something equals 28. So that double tap expresses the important number. To make it stronger, I face the students. 7 times something equals 28. 7 times something, Darren, equals 28. So that tap, tap, look, eye contact, the verbal communication rather than the back of my head. 7 times something equals 28. Those little things help process worked examples and support, in some respects, so you've got terms called cognitive load theory, which I'll come to in a moment, and redundancy effect, presenting far too much information. I'm going to just signpost these 2. Paul Kirshner and Miriam Nealon. They both work in Amsterdam. They're both academics. Paul Kirshner, I signposted this book yesterday in my beginners, How Learning Works. He's written this book with Carl Hendrick, who's a teacher who's just done his PhD. And what I love about this book in particular is lots of individual articles or academic papers that they've tackled, and they're probably 4 or 5 pages each in length, and really accessible. And what I loved about this blog, I'm just going to open it up. So their blog, 3-Star Learner, I had a good read through this. They've actually got loads, so I actually subscribe to it. I don't think they don't publish a lot here, but when they do, it's all about cognitive load. So you can see one was published a couple of days ago. I've not read this one yet. A good buy about growth mindset. A lot of growth mindset research is being debunked by by other academics, that you just have to be positive to have a growth mindset, all those types of claims. So anyway, there's a blog in here, and I've summarized it here. To sum up work examples, they're simply the most effective tool to help kids solve problems, or novices, I should say. So that's probably worth a read when you dig it out. I'll send you the blog link in the email that I send with this video. I'm going to pause for a question, so I'm coming up to the next 20-minute slot. Back to John Tibke's research, discussions on memory in education become polarized. I'm sure most of you are on social media. I get my, with my large audience, I'm not shy of provocation or critique, and I don't claim to know everything or be the best in the world, but certainly with social media, a lot of perception of it comes out that way. And I guess all of it is unhelpful, because what we're essentially doing is sharing knowledge to upskill ourselves and to, in turn, support our kids. So John talks a lot about why it's important that we learn about memory as teachers. So to put it bluntly, you've maybe got a position of some teachers that might call themselves traditionalists, some other teachers might call them progressives. In my view, they both work. Everything needs context, but I just thought I would just signpost that particular debate, because a lot of dialogue today, particularly people watching in England, is about a knowledge-rich curriculum, retention of facts, cognitive load theory, which is now immersed in the Ofsted inspection system. All these things are helpful, but with lots of disclaimers that I don't want to get into details here for this webinar. Anyway, I'm going to pause. Before I come into the next topic, which I call desirable difficulties and cognitive load theory, does anyone have any questions? Any questions? Grab a quick glass of water, stick your head out the window, get some fresh air. It's another 20-minute break. Anyone got any questions?
Yeah, can I ask you something?
Of course, Caroline.
It's about working memory. Am I right in thinking that working memory is something that you can train and that won't stay fixed in an individual?
My understanding is, yes, you can train it, but it's still limited.
Right.
However, if you think of, I don't know, all those people that win Mastermind and what have you, or I don't know if you know Bobby Siegel, a mathematician, a maths teacher. So I'm doing my same doctoral course as Bobby, and he's a bit of a TV celebrity and a maths teacher, but he talks a lot about memory and why he loves maths, why we all need to bust perceptions of maths, full stop, with the general public. But he also talks about how he learns all these quizzes and multiplications and all sorts of things. And it's quite interesting because it's through training and repetition. So I don't know enough, so I can't answer it confidently, but I do think with training and practice, you can expand your working memory. It's a bit like that little bucket analogy.
Yeah.
We have different buckets, so you can increase your bucket. I've got no knowledge of how large that bucket can grow and how much information you can store. I guess, you just speak to wise people out there, cognitive scientists rather than me, who's just trying to read and learn a bit more. So I hope that helps. Anyone else got questions?
Yes, Ross, I've got a question.
Oh, yeah.
Similar to that problem, actually. So would it be that your working memory is just general? So I have a certain size working memory, other people have a different one. Or would I have, for example, my maths working memory is different from my English language working memory? Or
Yeah, so have you ever done a CATS test with your kids? Cognitive ability tests?
No, not specifically.
A lot of, well, I wouldn't say a lot, some secondary schools or I think of some software that I've used. GL Assessment use a cognitive ability test, and they're probably one of the largest in the country, probably also in many schools around the world, where they have a certain test that kids conduct. It's a bit like doing a mixture of visual tests on screen, or responding to sounds, or filling in blank letters, or things appearing, and essentially it maps out audio, spatial, cognitive abilities, and then it reports back on a score. But not a lot of schools use these scores to predict kids' abilities. So I might be super talented in art, and it's recognised by the teacher, but I then go to the English lesson and I can't put a pen to paper and write and spell words, and then the other teacher might think, well, I'm not very gifted and what have you. So then that essentially attributes that our working ability is very different in different subjects, and essentially it goes back to that the phonological loop of the brain and the audio-visual sketch pad. So I guess the answer is yes, but again, without me being a qualified neuroscientist or a brain surgeon, that's where my knowledge becomes a bit limited. I guess it's something for you to explore.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on, folks, just for the webinar. If I just put you back on mute, you can unmute yourself in a moment. I just want to get through the last section in 15, 20 minutes, and then I'll take questions at the end. So I'm going to come to the cognitive load theory and answer some questions in your chat box. I'm going to load up this video. This is Robert Bjork, wife's same surname, so Bjork and Bjork research, when students were put into a situation in which retrieval was more difficult, they became better. So Caroline, your question about working memory, it's important that each time we test, and again, going back to what Darren asked earlier, each time you retrieve, it should become increasingly harder, because I don't like using the word assume. You need to test that it's getting stored through long-term retrieval, and then that transfer of new knowledge, you tweak. I'm trying to think of an example. If I go back to that example, the next lesson, I take away the guidelines. The next lesson, I don't give kids a demo, I ask them to do it themselves. The next lesson, I bring Carol up to the front and she does it in front of the whole class. So that's me increasing the difficulty. I want you to watch this short video. I'll just make sure I get it at the right second place, and I'm going to just let you hear it for a minute. I'll just make it full size. 28 seconds. Okay, here we go.
Many other informations. Many years ago, early in my career, I wrote a chapter with the title "Retrieval as a Memory Modifier," and the notion is basically, at that time, that rather than retrieval being a readout of the system, like the way you might play something off a compact disc or play it out of a computer and just leave it the way it was, that retrieval altered the system. So as I retrieve something, it becomes more accessible, stronger, more recallable in the future. And one of the sort of unfortunate things more broadly in education is that testing has come to be thought of in its assessment sense. That in fact, some audiences that I talk to, testing is such a kind of bad word that I will talk about something like retrieval practice instead. But tests induce people to retrieve from memory, and that act of retrieving does more than just provide evidence that that information's in there. It makes it more recallable in the future. The other thing that...
Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. So there's loads more to watch, but testing's good, okay? Testing's good. So I'm going to just signpost the research. That's Robert Bjork, 1992. Desirable difficulties increase the kind of level of retrieval. Now, if I just type retrieval in my search bar, a couple of things I want to signpost. One is a piece of research by Jeff Karpicki. It's this blog here called The Rule of Three. In this blog, his research unpicks that in his particular study, where they retrieved 3 times, the kids had up to 150% retention. So please read the research, but my kind of claim now is test your kids at least 3 times. That's one thing to have a little look at later. That's a 3-minute read, and there's links to the original paper. And then I've interviewed 2 lovely ladies, Dr. Pooja Agarwal and Patrice Baines. And they've written this other fantastic book, which is on my shelf, called Powerful Teaching. So there are 2 podcasts there, and I asked them, give me a definition for teachers. What is retrieval practice? And they simply said, the simple art of writing it down or saying it out aloud is sufficient enough for long-term storage. So you've got lots of kind of common things that keep coming back. Repetition, rote learning, testing, high stakes exams, another matter, low stake quizzing in class, brilliant for retention. Okay, cognitive load. Now, someone left a question about cognitive load and Ofsted theory. I can answer that one separately. If I just type my email in the chat box for everyone, send me an email with some questions that I might not answer. Okay, cognitive load. There are 2 key areas here. First one's called intrinsic load. Intrinsic load is the worksheet, the textbook, the video that you use, the material. So it's a bit like my slides and me presenting it. This is intrinsic load. In 30 seconds, here is a definition. The number of elements that you have to process simultaneously. So by me reading this as well as you reading it, I've already increased your load. Okay. So it's the material. Intrinsic load is, I just say the worksheet. Okay. An example here, could you translate the following words in French to English? Now, I was pretty good at French in year 7, but then I never studied it. I moved to 7 schools as a child and I studied Welsh, German and Italian. No wonder I can't learn any languages. I got confused far too early. So this is a simple example. And then how this can be increased. So making this material. So if this was the worksheet, translate this text. This is a sample text that a teacher could probably do quite easily. To make it harder, although this task isn't difficult, if I then say, can you translate this text in 30 seconds, I then make that harder. Okay, over time, with practice, you maybe could translate this in 30 seconds. Okay, so it's really, really interesting about how easy you can make a worksheet become very challenging and add unnecessary load. The other definition, or shouldn't say definition, the other aspect of cognitive load theory is you've got intrinsic load and extrinsic. Intrinsic is the worksheet, that's my schema, the worksheet, you come up with your own. Intrinsic is how I present it. So if I spent this whole webinar without my video on and you saw my red logo, it probably changed the whole experience. So these little decisions matter, and I've actually read during lockdown, the size of your video, the smaller the better. So it's good to have a small one, a small video, not a big video. Extraneous load, form of working memory load that refers to the load imposed. Okay, essentially these elements can be controlled by who does the materials, who presents it. So that's you, and it can be relevant or harmful. So just going to be clear on these. This is cognitive load, and there are 2 types. Intrinsic is your worksheet. Extrinsic is how I present the worksheet. Okay, and I think for all of us, including me, I probably need to read a little bit more on that. Now, this is where teaching gets a bit nuanced. Now, last time I presented this, I've had a few questions. I'm going to try and make sure that I'm really clear. On the left-hand side, we've got example of something that might be beneficial for kids. I do an example of how to draw a cube. Something that might be harmful for kids is I let them just do it by themselves, go off and discover. So we hear a lot of talk about discovery learning or group learning. Now, what I've done deliberately underneath is I've added, let's set kids a homework poster, draw a poster of a volcano for homework. That could be beneficial if it's a retrieval exercise. If I maybe context September or July, 4-year-old or 16, if I set draw a volcano in a poster as a homework, it could be harmful. Again, with a worksheet, right, kids, here's a word search. I want you to go off and quiz yourself and spot the words, and let's just test what you can remember from last month. Again, it could be harmful. So I hope this makes sense. All the things that we do in our classroom could be beneficial and harmful, which is why teaching is incredibly nuanced. if you ask me any question, I will first need to work out what subject are we talking about. So Darren talked about history earlier. I could ask what age group, Darren, I don't know if you can put in the chat box for us. At what point in the academic year would you teach that part of the curriculum? How many kids are in your class? How long you've been teaching? All these things are going to make a bit of a difference. And as you develop teaching experience, your wisdom, that allows you to then translate and do things through your own semantic and episodic experience as a teacher. What I found really interesting recently is, as the older I get, so I'm 46 and a half years old, and I look at teacher attrition as part of my kind of doctoral research. As you get physically older in the profession, we lose more experienced teachers. So in England, we have about 350,000 qualified teachers who don't work in schools. So we've got a retention crisis, not just a recruitment crisis. But an interesting thought for you. The child, if we think of them as a product, and I know we don't like to do that in teaching because it's not a business, but the child, as you leave and get another year group each year, they're the same. They're the same age, the same ability, the same cognitive ability, and we're teaching them the same material. And as we get older and wiser and slower and more cynical and tired quicker, the child still comes with the same bundle of energy and the same cognitive load, which is why teaching in some respects is easier for us as teachers because we're repeating, but the kids, we're working with the same product, etc., etc. So I hope this part, I'm trying to explain the nuance of teaching and how it evolves physically for us and what it might be perceived as a child on the other side. So Darren's got January, 8 years of teaching, and it's year 9 kids, S3, and 25 to 30 kids. So already a bit of context allows us to then translate and give some tips. So it's really important. Some of you took part in the beginners webinar yesterday, some of you didn't. Some of you are looking at this for the first time, some of you might watch the video back, some of you won't. And this will often manifest itself in, particularly in the classroom, oh, miss, I've revised, and I crammed it all in last night, and I think I now remember it all. So I mentioned this in the beginning of the webinar. Trish Taylor talks about that we must forget in order to remember. So I wonder if I could challenge all of you not to watch back the video or look at the slides until Monday, okay? Just in terms of retrieving, because but if you just wake up tomorrow, I mean, you'll all have your different methods, but if you just go to bed and sleep in it and think, right, what can I remember from Ross's webinar yesterday? That's probably one thing worth exploring, because that's already started to get embedded into your long-term storage. You're not going to remember all the 50, 60 slides that I've shared, but maybe one. So that's probably what I'd ask you to do first of all. So there's just some key things there. That retrieval, that forgetting. I guess the challenge for all of us is all this theory, how do I translate it into practical ideas is the challenge. I can present you with all mine, but you'll have your own as well. And if that's what you're wanting, then I can ping some ideas, again, if you send me an email. I'm going to finish with a couple of techniques. So these are a bit of my Mark Plan Teach, Just Correct Teaching, just things that I've been reading. These are 10 evidence-based teaching and learning strategies. So I'm just going to put this full slides for you. And this comes from Trish Taylor's Connect the Dots. And I think of some of the stuff that I've done in my career and also with Mark Plan Teach. Explain, okay? Allow kids to self-explain, allow them to summarize, highlighting. Mnemonics, on this one I've put here, you know, the knuckles, what are the months of the year and the days? I always forget, so I've got January, February, March, and you got the double knuckle in the middle. Any way to help remember acronyms, the months of the year, those types. They talk about imagery for text, rereading material. We all are getting very confident about a retrieval practice. If you're not familiar with space practice, it's kind of spacing out the content over your curriculum. So again, my schema is, right, I've got a schema work, volcanoes, whatever else, I'm testing. And as I go through the curriculum, rather than test them at the end, I'm regularly retrieving the volcano unit as I go through the curriculum. The challenge for us as teachers, as we know, is that pressure to teach to the test and make sure we cover all the components of the curriculum makes it very hard to squeeze everything in. which is why the last graphic there, number 10, interleaving, I've tried to put in a picture there of a volcano and the Earth, landmass. And you can just see the number of times I've put it in, where the gaps are. So volcano and landmass, just volcano, gap there, you know, so you get the idea. So if you need to read a little bit more on these two in particular, it's worth exploring. All these are pretty straightforward for most of us. I'm sure you're already doing all those, but these are time and time again. If I look at retrieval practice research, Trish Taylor's research, Barrett Rosenshine's research, the 17 principles. What I'll do quickly, just give you one more. If I just load this up. I put out a resource recently called Create an Effective Feedback Loop. So this is on my site, you can download. This is from a bit of research I did for Mark Plan Teach by, let me just get this one up. By Nicol and McFarlane Dick, 7 Good Principles of Feedback. I think they're in fact, exactly the same as what Barrett Rosenshine says. Clarify what a good performance is. Right, kids, here's a good cube. Okay, now I give some self-assessment. Well done, not so well done, try this. Consider how I give feedback, physically, verbally, non-verbally. Encourage a bit of dialogue in class. Well done today, Ross, XYZ. This part's the hardest one for us all. So all these tips, what you do in class is the hardest task of a teacher. And all these become a feedback loop to help me reteach. So what I've done is, I created a 7-stage feedback plan, just come up, you know, I'm like for lots of fancy names, a 5-minute lesson plan, things like that. So what I've done is, all these subtle gray things are prompts. You'll see here, this 6th one is the interventions. That's where my kids are at. So Darren's mentioned, you know, he's 30-year kids in that unit. That's where he needs them to get to. He's then got to choose his interventions along the way and think about spaced and interleaving and all the retrieval quizzes. One other thing I'll squeeze in, so I'm slightly running out of time, supporting self-regulation. The more things you equip kids to do, I firmly believe as teachers, we're trying to get kids to self-regulate their behaviour and their learning. That's why, you know, to be a good citizen and to learn stuff. So I set a task, okay, right kids, do this cube. Inside this whole grey zone are the things that go on inside a child's mind. They have their prior knowledge, they have their own motivations. I'm tired, screen time, diet, those types of things. I set my goal based on what Sir's told me to do. I select a range of strategies. I then decide what I'm going to do with those strategies based on what I think I can do, plus my mood, plus how strict Mr. McGill's been in class. That affects my cognition, my attention, paying attention, and my behavior. I'm going to be excited or not so excited. And I observe this taking place in the class, if I can, because there's 30 of them and just one of me. And I use this to provide feedback. And I'm a big fan of verbal feedback, as some of you will know. And again, that's the loop. So that's the research behind it. That's what I've tried to make it look like in a graph. And that's it on a map if you want to work it all out. So that will need you to translate. There's that graphic, Darren, that I mentioned earlier, that retrieval practice. Last month, kids, volcanoes. Last week, biomass fuel. Last lesson, X. Today, could you spell whatever it is for me today, or draw a map of a volcano and label it? And I think this is just a 3-minute exercise that all kids can do. And I would recommend this is large A3 paper laminated. Give kids a board pen and get them to write it down, wipe it off each lesson. There's a quick 10 ideas for retrieval practice. That's from Powerful Teaching. There, so you've seen all these things before. But if I pop back to finish on the memory slides. So you've got my Mark Plan Teach stuff that I've already put out for years. There's John Tibke's book. I just finished with these 2 important slides. So John, from a neuroscientist point of view, and I'm going to finish as an educationalist. All this stuff's given us new ways to teach, but in some of it, it's stuff that we've always done. Retrieval practice is what teachers call revision. We've always done revision. So I guess being aware of retrieval and spaced and interleaving gives us new ways to teach things that we've taught before, but in different ways. The adolescent's brain, really interesting. If you've not done any cognitive ability tests in your school, it's something you should be pushing for. My son was born premature. I did a fascinating podcast with Barry Carpenter. In fact, let me just put the podcast on the screen. Barry Carpenter is the first professor of mental health in the UK. This one here, podcast 81. And he's a huge advocate of special needs and prematurity work across the UK. And it's his mission in his new role with government to try and get every school to receive an MRI scan of every child, because that's going to allow us to see how their synapses and neurons work. And if they're born premature, I know my son came out 3 months too early, every decision mattered. And when the doctors came to scan his brain, his heart, his balls, everything was different. And then that affected his cognitive ability for many years. And I'll still say he's very much behind his peers, born in the 4th percentile. So all this information, particularly premature kids, 1 in 9 kids are born premature, so you'll have at least 3 or 4 in your classroom, and they're going to be way cognitively behind their working memory. And if they've got ADHD, they're 100 times more likely to be excluded in British classrooms. So all this kind of stuff. I'm quite fascinated with motivation. What kind of motivation leads to better progress? I know a lot of initial teacher training universities are now teaching their trainee teachers all this stuff. I think learning about memory was the biggest gap on my training course in 1993. Otherwise, I think I covered most other things. So if you're not looking at cognitive science already in your schools, please do, because otherwise you're going to be left behind the rest of the nation. And then a couple of things here. Imagine if your appraisal targets were based on cognitive science. Wouldn't that be exciting, rather than being set 3 targets to get kids grade A's and what have you? And then education policy will be influenced by biology and neurofeedback. I love that word, neurofeedback. So that's what John recommends. These are mine. Cognitive science has to be a school priority. If we're really interested in research, then are you research-rich culture? Does your school protect 0.1% of its school budget for CPD? So my last school, we had a turnover of 10 million quid, 7.5 to 8 million pound was on staff salaries. 1% equated to £100,000. That's a secondary school in Westminster. That's a huge amount of cash. Over 3 years, it disappeared to about 30 grand. So you're looking at 300 quid per staff at 100 grand. So I had 250 staff, 110 teachers, 150 support teachers. And then to 30 grand, it was 30 quid. So you can't do much. So it's important to create a culture in your school where you can share this knowledge, sign up for free blogs, sign up for research and podcasts, those types, and share. And particularly, and I know I've gone over my 20-minute threshold here, and I'm pushing your working memory now, create 20, 30-minute CPD sessions for your staff. All your schools should have someone on your teaching and learning team in charge of research, reads the paper and translates it into a 300-word read, a 1-minute read for teachers. When I look at all my analytics behind my website, the average reading time of teachers is 1.5 minutes. So I try to make sure my blogs are 400 or 500 words long in length, and any research that I share. And then be aware of cognitive dissonance. There'll be no surprise. 1 or 2 of you will disagree with me. 1 or 2 of you, I may not have made it very clear what I'm talking about, because we've both got different working memories. I'm performing here. I'll have forgotten certain things that I needed to share. If I just put in here bias, there is a great blog that I would recommend you read. I only got interested in this through social media. With a lot of people saying not very nice things about me. It's important here to look at different bias and then understand what it looks like. And what I've tried to do is just review a sentence of what it means, and then a statement of what it might be said on the corridors or around a classroom table or a school leadership table. One example, availability heuristic. Ross talks about we all need to learn about memory. I saw someone mention it on Twitter. We need to take it seriously. That would be you suffering from that particular bias. Okay, so just have a look, type in 15, 4-minute read and upskill. I know 200 schools, 12 million readers, 25,000 teachers face-to-face, marking, driving teachers crazy in every school I visit around the world, regardless of types of school, primary, secondary, independent, international. So forever, we need to try and work out better ways of planning and marketing and reducing that burden, and starting to steer more towards allowing teachers to get immersive research, cognitive load, long-term memory, and then use this to inform our teaching and learning policies and our kids' cognitive abilities, rather than mark once a week and use the purple pen of progress. Okay, we need to do things differently. So those are the books and the blog. I'll try and reference the exact blog from Kirshner and Neelan in the email. Probably take about an hour to compress the video. I'll send it over. There is my email address, this one here. I'll send you the slides. Feel free to disappear. I'm going to hang on the line if anyone's got any questions. I don't claim to know everything. I'm just getting quite interested in memory, and I'd like to learn more about the brains, particularly the different lobes, and then work out how it affects our ability to learn. And I think the challenge for us all as teachers is, right, there's the research, there's the theory. How do I turn that into A, strategies, and 2, resources? And that's going to make our jobs always forever hard. And I think the more we get interested in this, all types of research, it's great for the profession. It's going to raise the status of us as practitioners. It's going to support that teaching is a complex business. The classroom is very complex. Teaching's a team sport. We need to share this stuff. And if anything, our politicians and our journalists are suffering from episodic experiences, their unreliable memories of what they experienced as kids at school years ago, and we need to bust those myths for them. So the more we read up, the more we raise the profile of the teaching profession, the better it is for everybody. So any questions, anyone? Otherwise, you're free to